indivisible with liberty and justice for all. First item here is public comment. Is there any public comment here today? Is there anybody online? Seeing none, we'll move over to the approval of the minutes for April 15th. I'm pretty sure that they're accurate.
Move for approval.
Second, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, we'll move on to new business 3A, report on the monthly financial reports for April 2025. Jeff?
Should be a year, however. As you know, we have discussed this in the past. Sometimes bills are paid upfront in the beginning of the year, so it kind of skews some of the percentages. Other times, some of our revenues come in later. But all in all, we're about 83, we should be around 83%. Everything will be trued up once we hit year end, because we tend to be a month behind in some of our invoices that we receive. We really won't have final numbers until probably mid-August, but when we look at this particular report, as I mentioned in the past, as you get closer to year end, it's more of a reporting mechanism. The things that tend to highlight are those GLs that are over budget, and they assist us in preparing next year's budget. If you have significant numbers under budget, we look at the same thing. So everything we glean from this report helps us to prepare next year's budget.
All right. Do you have any questions or comments about that, Russ?
Yeah, Jeff, this is just satisfy or to answer my curiosity here. On the first page here, you get the delinquent account charge. I see that you anticipated in 23 was 1814, in 24 you anticipated budgeted for 3816, and for this year, it looks like that if I'm reading this correctly, that you had budgeted $71,000. What is that all about?
Yes, sir. Back in, and I can't remember exactly what year it was, as I wasn't here, with COVID and all, the state suspended suspension of services, and that prevented us from doing lockoffs. Prior to that time frame, when we had delinquencies, the reminder notice is $10 per notice. The 71,000 was about where we would anticipate being. As we put together this budget, we were looking to reinitiate the reminder notice process. There's been some correspondence with customers. We're moving ahead in that direction, and we'll probably see charges starting in July. Kelly had sent out notices on their bills, telling people we'd give them that they're coming, the fees are coming, that we give them notice. So within this next billing going out, people will know that, and it's cycle one going out, that if they are late in their payments, they will receive a reminder notice and a $10 fee. So moving forward, those fee revenues will increase and get back to normal.
Okay. So that this, then it could logic or legitimately be an income revenue source, but even the people that choose for foreclosure or something, don't we have the ability to put it on teeter to get reimbursed for the delinquency?
We do have teeter as an option. However, what we would like to be able to do through this reminder notices or late notices is to get people to get back to a more regular payment process.
Right.
And we've had success with that in the past. I think some of the customers have just gotten so used to not having a financial penalty for sending in late payments that they just delay their payments. And some of them actually will then wait till it goes on teeter. We want to minimize that. And in fact, Kelly will be here later on today to talk about delinquencies and such.
Okay, and I don't want to take too much time on this, but I was struck by the you budgeted $819,000 and $819,600 to the revenue from the North Fork Power, but we're 200,000 short. Do we get payments on that monthly or something?
We do, but we're always lagging a month
Okay, all right,
when we get our checks from NCPA
okay,
and MID. MID is a little bit lower this year. We're still trying to reach out to them and figure out why New Hogan has less revenue than anticipated. But NCPA is more based on, is formula driven, and Bureau of Reclamation's construction cost index code is what they use to determine our revenues.
okay, right, that's all.
All right, anything else on 3A? Anything else, 3A from staff? Okay, we'll move on to 3B, discussion direction regarding fiscal year 25-26 draft operating budget.
Thank you. I'm going to refer to the PowerPoint that you have in front of you. There, the staff report went into the process that we have regarding developing the budget, similar to every year that we've produced our operating and CIP budgets. This item before you is the draft operating and CIP budget. We would like your input on this, take it to any changes that you recommend. We would then take it to the board on the 28th next week as a preliminary. At that point, the final input, and then we bring it back on June 11th as a proposed budget. So it's an iterative process. Here's kind of an outline of what we're going to discuss today. We're going to review the budget assumptions, some of the challenges we're facing in both water and sewer operating budgets and CIP as well. We're going to take a look at the draft water, wastewater, and hydropower budgets. Remember, now we have 3 funds. We're going to get into fund types, functions, and reserve balances, because one of the things that I want to make sure that everybody is aware of are the reserves requirements that the district has and how we are addressing those and making sure we try to stay in compliance, because that was one of the items that was brought up in the rate study. We're going to compare water, wastewater, and hydro operating budgets to the rate model. And then we're going to take a look at our draft water and wastewater CIPs. Now, going back to the 2023 rate study, we had the study identified some key shortfalls in both the water and sewer enterprise funds. There was a structural deficit in the water operating fund. We weren't collecting enough revenue to cover expenses. There has been an ongoing negative fund balance in the sewer fund, the operating fund, and both funds were not meeting their reserve requirements. And I've got some slides in the future to talk about, show the reserve requirements that we need to meet. Some of the other challenges, and this, I'm going to sound like a broken record, inflationary pressures, regulatory requirements, aging infrastructure and equipment, and now uncertainty with state and federal grant programs. The upper 3 things we've talked about each and every year. In looking at the draft budget, this is in comparison from the adopted budget for 24-25 to the combined budget, draft budget for 25-26. If you look at on a year-to-year basis, our revenues have gone up, but our expenditures have also gone up. And I'm going to identify this fund by fund. So it's a little easier to identify and understand what the changes are. There is one new line item that you see at the very bottom, right above total uses. We've done transfers out for capital projects before. That goes into the R&R funds to fund water and sewer projects. But we also included now a transfer out to reserves because we're going to need to replenish some of our reserves, specifically the 90-day operating reserve and some of our, and the sewer operating fund. And we'll get into that in just a moment. So in looking at this, the draft budget has a basically a overall surplus of all three funds of about $70,000, which when you look at a $39 million budget, that's very minimal. Now, on the water side, where the sources of revenues, uses our expenditures. If we look at the total revenues, we're looking at about $2.3 million more in the budget from 25-26 into versus 24-25. Two things come to mind there. One is the rate increase that's set to go in place on July 16th. The other is some non-operating revenues that we've seen in the past. So we get some increases from property tax money, and that falls under non-operating revenues. On the usage side, there's a increase of about 2.3 million. Salaries and benefits went up about 592,000. That's step increases, but there's a significant increase in medical insurance costs and PERS costs. Service and supplies, we have increases there, and I'll get to that in a moment. Capital outlay went down, but debt service increased. And that's because of the new loan that we're going to be issuing for the water CIP program, 16.5 million thereabouts. That's we're working on right now, and it's going to come back to your board on the 28th. So that additional debt service is why you see that increase in that line item. On the sewer side, you have about $960,000 more in revenues. Most of that is coming from rate revenues on operating revenues, although there is a portion of that that's an increase in the non-operating revenues. Now, what does that mean? That's basically the fees we receive from the credit card transactions, because we charge a certain amount for different credit card and banking transactions. That has gone up because we have many people using that program. On the uses side, salaries and benefits again, service and supplies. Capital outlay did go up, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Debt service went down because we paid off one of our VAC-ons, and we were looking to issue a little bit more debt this upcoming year. That's going to be deferred a little bit because we've got moving forward with the USDA loan for Arnold wastewater treatment plant. And that will be iterative because USDA now, they used to provide us reimbursements on a quarterly basis for our expenditures. Now it's a different game. We have to fund all the improvements up front by securing an interim financing agreement, generally through a bank. When the project is complete, they will reimburse us for all expenditures, plus the interest that we had to pay for that interim financing. And that's already built into the loan requirements. About $700,000 is what we estimate on interim financing costs. The $800,000 in transfers out to reserves that you see for this year, we're trying to bring our fund balance up and our reserve balances up. So in addition to maintaining or funding our sewer operations and sewer CIP, which that $2 million figure is, we're trying to right the ship, so to speak, get our reserve balances up to where they need to be. And that's critical because as you move forward and issue debt, or even coming back and having banks look at your audit statements to make sure you're in compliance with the loan covenants, we want to make sure that we're meeting all the reserve requirements as well. On the hydropower fund, this is a new fund that we created in 24-25. Basically, we broke out all those revenues and expenses associated with the North Fork project and the New Hogan project and FERC relicensing costs. And that's what you see here. Last in 24-25, we anticipated a net surplus of about $500,000. It's similarly a similar amount for this year for 25-26, but we're going to put $500,000, transfer $500,000 out in a reserve. We're trying to build our reserves to be able to go through this FERC relicensing process. So that's why you see that as a new line item under the hydro power fund. Here is the operating budget by department, all the different departments. We did break out debt service from non-departmental just to show what it actually is. You can see it's about 2.9 million more in expenses. The largest comes from utilities. They are our largest department, but we're also going to be investing significantly in our capital outlay budget through them. We've got a number of projects which we'll go through. And we also have been dealing with inflationary costs, everything from leak repairs to maintenance to chemical costs. And we'll dive into that in just a moment. Please feel free to stop me at any time. Here is the payroll budget. It's broken out by department, and you can see the changes. Here's the breakdown. We have salaries and wages, payouts, on-call pay, standby pay, overtime. Payouts happen once a year, and by the MOU, they have the ability to cash in some PTO time. So they have to have a number of hours on the books, and they project that over 80 hours, if they have more than that, they can go ahead and cash some of it out. We have to carry PTO as a liability on our books. So, and this is kind of, Michael and I talked about this recently. He's been diving into this. It's called compensated absences. It shows up on your balance sheet at the year-end audit. We have to put a dollar amount of all the PTO that all the employees have accrued, and then we have to account for that as a liability. There are ways to reduce that. Obviously, PTO payout is one of them, but there's also going to be a new GASB coming into play. When is it? And Michael's boning up on that, because that we have to include in this upcoming audit. We have to do it just similar like what we do with all the other GASB pronouncements. We have to make sure it's accrued for correctly. Deferred inflows, deferred outflows. We're fine.
Can you explain again what Gatsby means?
Government Accounting Standards. It's the think tank back in DC that sits around and comes up with new rules and regulations regarding finances and accounting for government agencies. Under employee benefits, comp time payouts, we've noticed an increased use of that, so we're kind of increasing that in the budget. Benefits are anything from dental, vision, and health insurance. We no longer do medical reimbursements. That should actually be eliminated there. Retirement expense, that's the normal cost for PERS. That's a percentage of salary that we remit to PERS after every payroll. The PERS UAL is the unfunded accrued liability that they give us $1 about, and we spread that amongst all the different departments. You'll see there under non-departmental, $512,012. We put the retiree cost for the UAL, the portion of the UAL that's associated with employees that have already retired, into that non-departmental. All the others are associated with current employees. So you can see out of the 829,000 of total UAL, 512,000 is associated with employees that have already retired. And finally, retiree health savings.
Hey, Jeff, getting back to this, the CTO payouts, I don't remember exactly when this came up, but didn't we make a big change that these payments, in prior times, they could have just been kept on the books for year after year after year. And we changed it to they have to be distributed annually. Is that correct?
Well, they don't, keeping it on the books is correct. That's part of compensated absences. And so we have to assign a dollar amount to it.
Yeah.
What we have found is there's employees are seeing this as an option to get additional income throughout the year and get paid right away get paid for their comp time, not through overtime like they would on a regular paycheck. This is, they submit a request through HR, say, I want to get paid off for 20 hours or 30 hours, and then we issue them the check.
Okay. But there's no mandated requirement that they do that annually. It's just their option.
There is a maximum amount of PTO time, I believe, Michael, is it?
Yeah, but that's PTO and CTO are different. We're
Yeah.
talking really the line item you're talking about is comp time, which is
Okay.
different
Yeah.
than PTO.
Right, so it's more,
So we instituted a lower cap on PTO banks, and then because of IRS regulations, we had to create a payout structure that complied with IRS requirements, but that's different than CTO.
Okay.
the other thing about comp time too, is some employees, instead of getting paid overtime, they'll request comp time and they can use that for future time off. Let's say I have 8 hours of comp time on the books. If you're an hourly employee, you've earned it. Then you want to take a day off, instead of using PTO, you can use your comp time.
Okay. All right, all of these phrases are probably deeply embedded in your, the jargon in your department, but it strikes me as being a little confusing when you say that things like the district's debt is funded in part by transfers. Isn't it, truthfully, what you're saying there is that the debt payment or the interest payment is, the debt isn't being funded, it's the expense payment is being funded.
That is correct.
Okay, well, why don't you say that instead of,
I will make that change.
well, no,
I
I'm
just,
not demanding anything. I'm
no,
just,
no,
and then the other one is that we issue debt. We don't issue debt. We agreed that we're going to borrow a certain amount of money. We're not issuing the debt. You see?
well, in the finance terms, there's an issuer and the lender. We tend to fall under, in public finance, we tend to fall under that as issuer.
We're the
That's
issue.
why I use that. Or I could just say borrow. We borrow money.
I know that bothers you too, doesn't it?
Please.
You were going to mention that if I hadn't, right?
Probably not.
No. Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
It's,
We're moving on to capital outlay budget. The majority of these, as you can see under the second column, is Department 54, which is operations. There's some for Department 50, non-departmental and water resources. There is one item here that, if you can see under the very bottom line, projects under Copper Cove wastewater treatment by drying beds rehab for $100,000. After discussion, we're probably going to move that into the CIP program and under the SAF tertiary project and use that as part of our local match. So that'll probably be shifted over into the CIP program, and I'll show you that later. The items that you see here, Damon has a great handle on explaining each and every one of them. The CCTV system replacement, that is a large dollar item, I agree. Backhoe and skid steer, we always are looking for either replacement or extra equipment in the field so we don't have to steal from, say, copper to use in lock and tenta. And so we have the adequate equipment to facilitate faster repairs and work. Security cameras is something that Dylan's been working with on IT for La Contenta and Vallecito. And we're also going to need to upgrade some of our server room network equipment. And that comes under Department 50. That's at 25,000. Underwater, we have hydrant replacements. That's an ongoing item. Ebbets Pass Water Treatment Plant SCADA systems upgrade. We have some money in our expansion fund up there at Ebbets Pass, and some of that is available for upgrades and rehabs. So we're going to use some of that money to pay for this project. There's going to be demo of the old copper water treatment plant in Wall Building. I think Director Thomas, you're familiar with that one. And then, as I mentioned, the drying beds. And we weren't able to get to it this year, but there's going to be some office remodel for additional office space. And in the CIP, as we jump into that, I've got a slide that talks about possible changes to that CIP. We're looking to add $50,000 to finish off the courtyard and add some landscaping. That may fall into the capital outlay item. And one more item down here, the Dowd's Fuel Break Project for $361,000. This is a carryover project from last year. It is grant funded. The grant funds show up in the water fund under federal grant revenues. So it's a wash.
And then also just to add to that, so Dowd's is grant funded. Some of these other projects, we don't identify the source of funding here, but office remodel, courtyard enhancement is probably admin replacement fund, so it doesn't affect the operating budget. Some of these are expansion fund. So funded by expansion fund. So again, won't impact the operating budget. We have restricted reserves that are set aside for those purposes that can't be used for anything else. And so we would be pulling from those funds to pay for some of these line items. Just want to clarify that.
On that Copper Cove drying beds rehab, Damon, are there existing drying beds at Copper Cove? Okay, so it's not just something that they put out on is it concrete surface or?
Well, we're looking at a couple different options. Kevin's team and my team met out there a couple weeks ago now, and so this is associated with the reclaim plant, the tertiary treatment system, and the installation of the SAF. So the SAF is going to do a really good job of removing all the algae and the solids that come out of Pond 6. And we're going to need somewhere to dry those so we can eliminate it. So the thought is we would gravity feed all of those solids down the hill from the reclaim plant and build a large drying bed with bays that our crew would build. And so the thought is you could build concrete retaining walls between each bay, and then you could have the base be sand, almost act like a filter, and you can direct all the liquid back into Pond 6 because it'll sit up above Pond 6. So that's the idea. The floor of those drying beds could also end up to be concrete, but I think currently we're leaning towards the filter. Essentially, it's gravel with sand on top, and so you can scrape the dried media or dried debris off the top, and a little bit of that media would go with it. But they would be large. So the thought is to give us enough room to operate that SAF and that reclaim plant at 1 MGD without having to jockey a bunch of solids around all of it.
Okay, yeah, I'd like at some future time to talk about approaching the county to get rid of those solids. We get them dry enough out at the landfill.
I'm working on that as we speak, actually. I have a draft for both the county on my desk that I've been working.
Okay, good.
For the district, not just for Copper.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any more questions on capital outlay?
Any questions?
Oh,
You're doing a fine job, Russ.
yeah, there we go. Just as a footnote, we are not requesting any new vehicles for this year. This coming year, 25, 26.
Yeah, and we are gonna, at some point, we've talked about providing the board, maybe it's this committee, we can talk about which the best way to do it is, but just an update on the enterprise vehicle lease program, because I think we have, I think the new development is the first generation of those vehicles that we leased was 2019, 2020.
2019.
And
Yeah.
we have now surplus those and essentially sold them off because they had cycled through the program. And they, we bought them. We had equity in those vehicles. We sent them back to Enterprise and receive, value for those. And then this year we decided we didn't have a pressing need to continue to replace trucks at the rate that we had been initially. And so we decided to hold off this year. We have some other capital outlay expenses that are higher than normal. And so I don't know, Jamie, if you wanted to add to that at all.
Yeah, happy to. So Mike and I actually are meeting with Enterprise in a couple of weeks to develop a presentation to present to y'all. So you can see kind of how the program is bearing fruit now after five and a half years. So 2019 vehicles were sold. And those equate to approximately 230 grand that the district can roll back into the program. And then, like Michael said, that allows us, we'll illustrate kind of how this lease program works in hopefully July with the presentation.
Yeah.
And then just to kind of touch upon what Michael acknowledged here, the CCTV system for 333,000, our CCTV van is circa 2006. So it's becoming a low population county vehicle where we have to literally track the mileage on a clipboard, and then we have to submit it to the Air Resources Board quarterly. And then the camera itself is 2016. And so we started to dive into the CCTV systems that exist currently, and they are light years beyond what our crews are working with. And so the ask, although a large one, would dramatically improve our ability to adhere to the requirements of our sanitary sewer system management program, the SSMP you guys might have heard of, and you're going to hear about again here in a future board meeting, and really just kind of keep all of the gravity sewer systems in good working order. So that's kind of the large ask on this list of capital outlay requests for this fiscal.
So tell me where the anticipated cost of that new CCTV piece of equipment is.
It's in capital outlay.
Yeah. Right. It's in sewer. It's pretty much a sewer tool.
It's the second line in capital outlay CCTV system replacement.
Okay.
I do want to highlight, one of the challenges that we have this year is we do have a VAC-on truck that's 2014 on its pass that is getting to the end of its useful life. And then we also have a 2004 that our utility crew still uses routinely that's pretty much done. And we use it as a low population vehicle, low population county vehicle. And so the thought is sometime in the near future, we're going to have to sell that vehicle out state and then make the pass back on the lower population county vehicle.
Which the restriction, it's a low mileage restriction. Basically, it's 3,000.
3,000 over 3 years. You can go up 3,000 in a year, but then you're kind of locked, or you can kind of milk that 3,000 over.
Well,
and so that request for a VAC-on is not on this list. Because that's the VAC-on prices, as you can imagine.
well, you'll have to get an electric power, right?
Yeah.
Well, actually, so if there's exemptions, so VAC-ons you can include in the exemption list. Right, yeah.
Yeah, I think the one we bought a couple of years ago was 700,000. So
Right, and they're still in that area.
They're not.
area.
Not getting cheaper, I imagine.
But I can't imagine that you would, in a year where you had to use it a lot, you wouldn't put 10,000 miles on it, would you? I mean, if it's up in the pass?
you're not gonna put a ton of road miles on it, you're gonna put a ton of miles on the actual system. So whether it's PTO or it has a secondary motor system, you're gonna put the miles on that, right? Okay.
Okay.
So we'll fit within that 1,000 or 3,000, like Michael said, requirement.
Mhm.
It's just things start just falling off the machine at some point, you know, and that's kind of where we're at, the 2000, where the guys use the machine daily and hydraulic hose flies off here, or the boom just lifts into the air. You know, there's just a whole host of things that crop up when you're off.
A lot of moving parts.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Let's continue.
Next slide in front of you is the debt service obligations for the district. The one thing I just want to highlight here is that the back on truck 2020 has been paid off. And we are adding a new line item for the water CIP line, water CIP loan 2025. There'll be principal and interest payments on that. And we'll be bringing that to your board next week. That's to allow us to fund 3 different projects in the water side of it, the Lake Tulloch Intertie, Copper Cove, C. And Sawmill Bank, yeah. Now, one of the things I mentioned early on was our reserves, how much money we need to have in our reserve funds, whether it's an operating fund or such. And this was something that was highlighted during the rate study. As I mentioned, the rate study showed water revenues not sufficient to support the operating, leading to structural deficits. We still had money in the operating fund, but we were spending more than we were bringing in. And if you look here, as of June 30th, 2022, we had just over $3 million in the water operating fund. It's Fund 300. By the end of this fiscal year, it's going to be down to 1.8 million. So that shows we're still drawing down more fund balance because we're just not bringing enough revenues. And going back to the rate study, it was the first 3 years of the rate study that really focused on the operating side, really getting it whole. In the sewer side, we've been negative fund balance there for many years. At the end of June 30th, 23, we were in the whole 1.7 million. I'm looking at the end of this year, just under 1,984,000. It's a definite improvement, but we still have a long way to go, especially because our policy states that we need a $500,000 reserve in our operating funds. We have some other reserves that I'm going to get into in just a moment that we're not meeting, but I think we have a plan to be able to rectify that issue. I think you've heard me mention the interest reserve fund, Fund 108, that we've had in the past. This year, through a lot of Michael's work, we split 108 into 308, 408, and 508. So water, sewer, and hydro have their own interest reserve funds. The ones I'm focusing on here are water and sewer. Now, this is the first column after the revenue, our reserve allocations, the names of them, is where we are year to date. We have a 90-day emergency operating reserve of just under 2.7 million. That operating reserve is supposed to be 90 days of our 1-year budget. So if we're looking at the budget, the water budget at 24-25, it's just under $18 million. We do not have enough in that 90-day operating reserve. We should have just under 4.5 million. We've got a $1.8 million deficit, and it grows to 2.1 next year. So that's one of the things we want to start looking at to address in here. We have all our other reserves seem to be pretty much spot on. We do have to have reserves for our USDA loans for the Ebbets Pass 3A, Reach 3A, and the AMI meter. You need a debt service reserve account, which incrementally increases to the amount of your annual debt service. Once you hit that, then it stays level. And then there's a short-lived asset reserve, which increases $5,000 as you go through the loan. So each year, we're going to have to be adding to some of those. So that is the biggest concern that I have is, again, the 90-day emergency operating reserve. And that shows up in the the sewer side as well. The sewer budget is not as much, it's about 6.7. We're supposed to have a $1.67 million reserve there. We're just under 1.1 million. So we've got a deficit there of 582,000, and it'll grow to the 795,000 next year. I do have two line items down below that are zeros. And as soon as we actually go through the final funding of the USDA Arnold wastewater treatment plant, and that's about a $10.2 million project. Is that correct, Kevin?
Yes.
That we will have to start setting aside money for those as well. The other thing I wanted to bring up is fund balance. This is something that we live with. Kylie, Michael, and I, we live through this process because this is critical for us to make sure we have money. And I used to mention this in the past. It's always easier to borrow money when you have money. If you don't have reserves and don't have money set aside, the banks look at you and say, I think you're not a very creditworthy risk. We have our operating fund, that's Fund 300, that's where operations, projecting at 1.85 at the end of the year. And with revenues coming in, expenses, it's going to go drop down to about 1.5 the end of next year. Part of that reasoning is we have some set asides for requirements for arbitrage and other costs that we have a limited, we have liability for those, accrued those liabilities. So if you look at the cash amount, it'll be a little bit higher, but we have to take into account that arbitrage is what we earned from our investments on the 2021 loans, or I'm sorry, 2022 loans. We made more in investments than we did in the rate we're paying, so IRS wants the money. So we've set aside that. But we did correct that last year by moving our money with your authorization to demand deposits like state and local government securities, which are not taxable. So we've remedied that, but we're still going to owe the IRS at the end of this loan period. The interest reserve on water, that's the old 108 water side. And if you go to your prior slide on 13, that shows you the detail of that, plus some additional revenues that we'll be receiving. That's a projected balance. We have some more interest revenue coming in. We have one more property tax allocation, a very small one, supplementals. And I also showed the old R&R fund, the CIP loan fund, and grants fund. So this shows you how money moves in and out of these different funds to help fund not only the operating budget, but our CIP budget as well. So when you see transfers out of capital R&R, some of that's for projects and some of that's actually for debt service. Any questions on the water side?
It seems to me that some of it's going for debt service, but there's a fairly large percentage that's going into build the reserves and to get your reserves to the minimum level.
To minimum levels. That's, well, in here, there is no money that I have currently to go into that 90-day operating. We don't have enough money right now to do that. However, at year end, when we go through and finalize the books, if there's additional funds, we can always transfer it over into that account. But I don't look to doing that until we close the books.
Okay.
I think we need to, just on that point, I think we need to make a point to report back to this committee when we close the books, what, and not just the audit report itself, but when we close the books, if there's a surplus or a deficit, where do we end up? And if there's a surplus, how is that allocated? And if it's to bolster reserves, great, but I think that's a conversation we need to have with this committee.
Yes, and as we get closer to the audit being complete, I think we can add a step that says, here's what the auditors look at. And then we can bring a draft of that audit document to the finance committee and or board, however you like, and say, here's our surplus. This is what we look at, what as far as how we move it before the final audit is done, because they will then in turn move things around based on what we recommend.
Let's
But
make
once
sure we
the audit is,
add that.
pardon me?
Let's make sure we add that step.
Yes, sir. Okay. There we go. Okay. In sewer, it's a very similar process that you see here. The difference here is I've added a line for the USD wastewater loan, 2.175 million. That's going to be the interim financing we're going to need to kick off year one of the Arnold wastewater treatment plant improvements project. We're going to work with an interim financing short-term loan with a bank. And as I mentioned, it'll be interest only to the bank and they'll get repaid once the project is complete. USDA funds that completed project. Any questions here?
Not now.
And here's the fund balances for hydro. One of the things that you're well aware of is mercury licensing is not cheap. So we wanted to start setting aside money for that process. The initial 2.4 million is from the PG&E settlement, and we want to keep adding to it. So we'll have our minimum level on the operating fund of 500, and at the end of the year, what I have here is looking at transferring money into the reserves so that we can build up that our quote unquote war chest. And question?
Well, this may not be exactly the right time to talk about that, but I think that we're all sort of anticipating that we might have to borrow some money to.
That is correct, and that's why having reserves, easier to borrow money when you have money.
Yeah. Okay.
So if that's the whole idea of separating out the hydro fund this year, is to create a track record.
Got it.
Because you need a couple years on your audits, because it used to be part of water and sewer. Now it's separate, and that way we create a track record, and it'll be easier to borrow money once we have shown a year or two of positive cash flows.
Will this 500,000 be enough to we're currently paying HDR. Let's see that MP3 and.
So are you talking about the transfer out or the transfer in the 500,000?
Yeah, interest reserve transfer in.
Yeah, so that I think is a safe amount.
So I went back to the hydro budget, and included in that number under services and supplies are those costs associated with consultants.
Okay.
So it is covered. And then after all those expenses, that's where we have the ability to move 500,000.
Oh, okay. Good.
Okay. On to the CIP budget. We started with the 5-year CIP that your board adopted or approved on March 26th. And that's where you see the budget. I'll show you in just a moment. But after discussion within staff, we talked about some possible changes here. One of it Damon already addressed, which was moving the Copper Cove wastewater treatment plant drying beds rehab to the Copper Cove SAP tertiary project, and this will be part of our local match. Damon also requested, as part of the capital outlay, $400,000 to upgrade the Douglas Flat Vallecito wastewater treatment plant UV system. That is a little bit higher than the threshold we have for capital outlay, but that is going to be funded by expansion funds in the Vallecito sewer expansion fund. We have adequate funds to pay for that. It's not coming out of operating funds or anything else. There is the Copper Cove Water Treatment Filter Rehab Project. It was again originally on the Ops Capital Outlay Program for $600,000, and he could explain that in a little bit more detail. And as I mentioned, that we want to finish off the back parking lot area of the courtyard, add adequate outdoor storage, and finish off this back area. And we're looking at about $50,000 for that. I'll probably end up moving it into capital outlay, but it can be used by one-time money, so the admin building fund or maybe a special project fund. It will not come out of operating revenues.
What's the landscaping?
Sorry.
Just some
kind of
cleanup in
landscape?
between this building and the courtyard.
Okay.
Just some cleanup in between the buildings. Should be relatively minimal. It's mostly focused on.
These trees are rubbing against the gutter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're falling behind a little bit. It's looking a little bit shaggy in general. But I think the highest priority for these funds is, how do we make the best possible use of the property operationally?
Here is the water CIP budget. It's something you saw back in March. It's going to be a little over 17 million in cash flow for 25-26. Some of that is carryover projects that we've been working on. Like the Jenny Lane AV transmission line, that I believe it shows here that it's going to be completed by the end of June 26th. And that is being used. We use the 2022 water CIP loan proceeds to pay for that one. The drought supply is grant funded. In part, we got a 10% match on that. And so I don't know if you really want to dive into each one of these because you're familiar with them all. And the same with the sewer side. So just under 5.9 million. Now, in my staff report, I mentioned, and I know we've heard this as a request to how do we stand versus the 2023 rate. If you'd like, I've got some slides to go over that, or I can leave until next Wednesday.
I'd like to look at it.
Okay. Here's on all plans. Remember we had the,
Are they contained in here or not?
no, they're not.
Okay.
Remember the rate study was at a time when we had water and sewer. Now we have water, sewer, and hydro. So when we look at the current budget, we really need to make sure we keep that in mind. If you look at the draft budget on revenues, it's 39.2 million. Rate study said we'd have 38.2 million. We're a little bit over $1 million over in our revenue projection. Most of those revenues come from the operating, the water fund, and non-operating increases primarily due to property taxes and hydro revenue increases and reimbursements. Property tax revenues were not budgeted to increase in the rate. And we get about 2% increase each year. So you're going to see a difference between what the rate model said and what we actually budget for now.
Well, with that unanticipated higher amount of revenue at $1 million, the suggestion was made that in view of that, that we ought to forego a certain portion of our next proposed increase. I'm not seeing that there's any, based on what I've heard so far, there's no justification for that. Is that correct?
I agree with you.
Okay.
And you'll see it more as we get into each of the different funds. But if you look at this,
So, sorry, Jeff, just to put a finer point on that, I think from my perspective, there's a couple of things that we have to remember in considering that question. One is we still have negative fund balances that we are making progress on, and we have been making steady progress on, but we're not even back to zero yet, and we're not meeting those reserve targets. But to me, the other, really important factor to remember is, when we adopted that rate study, we did not fully fund our CIP and the infrastructure needs that we had identified in that process. And so, the challenge to staff was we need to get out and, be even more aggressive in pursuing grant funds and other sources of funding, which, we are doing. But at the same time, those sources of funding have dried up to some degree. So they're even more competitive than they have been historically. So to the extent there is, to the extent we're coming out ahead from what we had actually projected, the need for the replacement of aging infrastructure still vastly exceeds our resources. I think it's just imperative for us to keep that in mind as we consider, because believe me, I'd love to be the one to come forward and say, you know what, let's not reduce rates as much as we had planned. That would be the popular thing to do. I don't think that's the right thing to do right now.
And what you said in the last minute and a half, any chance you could have that transcribed so we could read it at the next board meeting?
I'll be there.
When somebody brings it up.
Yeah, it's being recorded. To follow that up, even though we had more revenues, we also had more expenses.
Yeah.
But then that bottom bullet, when it says hydropower revenue increases, part of that increase is associated with increases in the state, federal, local dam and licensing fees we pay. Because we get reimbursed for that, but we have to pay those expenses and we get reimbursed for them. So they go up equally. So the net is pretty much zero, except for MID, which we know we get about 90% of it back. NCPA, they reimburse us 100%.
So we could blame it on those dam expenses?
There we go.
Okay.
But yes, and to follow up on what Michael said about the CIP, when we went through the final changes through the different iterations, we did move a number of CIP projects out of the 5-year rates scenario.
I think he's responsible.
Not because they're not critical projects.
Right.
It's just because we had, we've had a mandate to pursue other sources of funding. And so we still need to try to find ways to fund those projects.
Yeah, and reduce the level of the increases too.
Well, I think that I don't know. There were a lot of intelligent people working on that rate study, and I think that it's commendable that we've come in as close to the targets as we have. So I'm not in the mood to apologize for any of that. Do you mind if I get a cup of coffee?
Go right ahead.
You want some? No?
Am I that boring? Jeff would say yes.
Not you so much, it's the subject matter,
This is true.
not you.
I just like how you keep talking about all the work that Michael's doing, because I hear that and it makes it sound like I'm very, I'm all over this stuff.
What you are.
Thank you, Michael Bear.
I'm sure we can keep going.
Okay, on the water side, operating revenue is up 255,000. That's largely due to the rate model. This is to higher credit card fees. When we were looking at the rate model, the fees we collected at that point are now 194,000 higher than what the rate model said, because we're having more people utilize that. And so that's the big part of the operating revenue, is the fact that the higher revenues regarding the credit card fees, not so much on the water side. On non-operating, we moved, it's decreased, and that's moving power revenues and reimbursements out of the water fund into the hydro fund. And going back to that credit card fees, our fees costs have gone up dramatically. And originally we were right around that 80–90% recovery, but we're getting more fees getting charged through us. And now we're only recovering about 58% of the cost. So our expenses are going up, but our revenues to offset them are not following suit. And that's because of higher costs and the interchange costs that we have to absorb. Similar story on the sewer side. In fact, revenues are a little bit less operating revenues than what the rate model said. It's mostly due to decrease in delinquent account charges, which Director Thomas addressed earlier, reimbursable expense and repair labor materials revenues. A lot of those are driven by requests from developers or homeowners for us to be able to do some work. Fee revenues are offset and have gone up, but also our third-party payment costs have also gone up, as I mentioned in the water side. And the decrease in non-operating revenues, again, is primarily due to shifting the hydropower revenues and the reimbursements from NCPA and MID to the hydro fund. Now, this one's a little easy because there was nothing in the hydro fund that we actually looked at as far as different costs because it didn't break it out. I can go into detail. This is kind of where we look at it. The increased revenues is moving 981,000 hydropower from water and sewer. This amount is 281,000 higher than what was in the rate model. So there is an increase from the power generation. And reimbursements have also gone up by 107,000 from the rate model, but tied in to increase in state and federal fees, which are $203,000 higher than the rate model. Now on the expense side, we're $971,000 more in expenses than we were in the rate model. And you can, here's just a quick look at it. Salaries and benefits were actually a little bit less than the rate model by 208,000. Service and supplies and capital outlay are higher. Debt service is lower. Part of that is because the model anticipated that we would take out a sewer loan in addition to a water loan in 25-26. But we decided to go instead through USDA to try to get some grant money. Unfortunately, we were not successful in that, but we did get a low interest long-term loan. But those interest payments will not be the same that we're paying on the interim as what was budgeted in the rate. So you'll see a change there. On the water side, there's salaries and benefits. A lot of that is we budgeted, the rate model budgeted a 5% annual increase for just about all salaries and benefits. Sometimes when the turnover and retirements you have, when you retire, when people retire, they're replaced by somebody coming in at a lower step. So we have savings there. Service and supplies are up by 350,000. Third-party processing fees, you already know about that. Retiree health, which I talked about, and insurance costs. That's our JPIA insurance, and the rate model did not adequately factor in all the changes in the insurance industry and costs that are associated with acquiring insurance through JPIA. So that's why you see a big increase there.
Who could have anticipated that?
That's a tough one. I did not.
That's tough on all of us.
Capital outlay costs. The reason for some of that going up was the backhoe, Copper Cove wastewater treatment plant building demo, the Dow's fuel break, which is 361,000, which again is offset by grant money. So it's a little, I don't want to say misleading, but you have to dive into the numbers to really understand the change there. Debt service has gone down a little bit. Part of that is due to the projected debt service payments for next year for the new loan are less than what the rate model anticipated. On the sewer side,
But before we go on, I want to ask you a question about this, the rehab of the copper. Wait a minute. No, what is it? $200,000 for demo. Yeah, the Copper Cove water treatment building. Is that over there at Kiva?
Yeah, this dollar amount would be for both the raw water building
Yeah.
and the treatment plant building, which includes the pressure vessel. So the number is an estimate because we still, have conversations with Copper Cove HOA about whether or not we can use that raw water building. Should we do end up raising the building, that budget request includes both.
Okay, that's a lot of money.
on the sewer side, same story when you're talking about retiree health, third-party processing, payment processing costs, and insurance costs. There's a note here. I'll come back to it for next, but our third-party payment processing costs, if I remember the numbers correctly, we budgeted $26,000 in the 2023 rate model for third-party processing costs. That's for credit card and other bank fees. Our budget this year is $467,000. That is a significant increase over the rate model. So when you look at increases in expenses, as I said, sometimes you have to dive into the numbers to truly understand them. People say, why are you spending that much more? Well, our costs of doing business are going up.
So anything we can do about that?
That's largely a pass-through though, right? I mean, it shows up as an increase in expenditure, and it is an increase, but that's largely covered by customers that are using those services.
Well, actually, right now, our customer coverage is down because we're down to about 58% of recovering our fees because the fees, that structure that we have is an older one. I think we did that several years back. And Tyler and the interchange keep raising their fees. And we kind of haven't been kept correct.
Yeah, so we could take a look at that again. At the whole structure, there are different, we contemplated multiple different ways to approach that.
Yeah.
60% is a whole lot better than what it used to be, which was 0.
Yeah.
But it has an impact on customers too. And so there's a balance there.
And we're also looking at possible other options to interchange providers to maybe be able to look at that and bring those costs down.
Okay.
And the biggest changes I mentioned for the hydro, we moved the revenues, the FERC related to federal and state fees from water and sewer into hydro. And these fees have actually are a little over 10,000 higher than the rate model. Not significant, but it is higher.
What position is being funded there in the hydro, that 113,000?
It's really a combination because what we do is we have project number. If Michael or Kelly or somebody does work on it, they put that into the payroll system and it applies those costs to them.
Okay, right.
Now, next steps.
Before we get into the next steps, years ago, this board approved a $65,000 annual amount of money that was provided for ratepayer assistance. Are we still, we're still funding that?
Yes, we are,
And that would be embedded in what?
in the water and sewer funds. We could go into the handout in your packet. I'll tell you exactly where that shows up. Okay, page 11 of the handout that came with the agenda under the sewer. I just picked that one.
Okay.
Line number 120. It shows as rate assistance program.
Okay.
And we have a similar one under the water side.
Okay, I'm sorry, I overlooked that. So first time I ever did that.
Any more questions regarding the budget at this point presented?
No, just I just always ask you for an acknowledgement that we can depend on these numbers, right?
Yes, you can.
Okay, great.
So other than that, we're asking your board to recommend that it go to, or your committee, recommend it go to the full board. If there's any comments or changes you'd like. The only thing that caveats that we're looking at is making those adjustments as I showed on the CIP. But other than that, it will, looking to take it to the board on May 28th with adoption on June 11th.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, okay. So,
Thank you. I don't know if there's any public comment.
is there any public comment? Any public comment line? You know? That's true. All right, we'll move on to 3C. Discussion direction regarding the annual standby assessments. Indian Rock. At the point that's passed, Union Cove, Saddle Creek service areas. This is always pretty standard. I hope we're not going to spend a lot of time on this.
My recommendation or my request is that you recommend this go to the full board for approval. There will have to be a hearing on June 11th, but then there will be, I guess, there will be an approved item by item, but there'll be resolutions for each one.
Okay.
But I've got a lot of questions.
Okay.
Well, I talked with Jeff about this, and as I suspected, if you wanted to change any of these things, one of them or all of them, you'd have to go through a full-blown 218 process, would cost $100,000 to increase it by 30,000 or something.
More than a 218 process. These are assessments, right?
Oh, that's right. So it would be, I think,
It'll make 218 look easy.
for rates.
Oh, yeah. All right, so I'm no longer going to request that we consider raising them, so.
Appreciate that.
We all do.
All right, so I think we should make that recommendation to take it to the board.
All right, we will do that. Now we'll move on to 3D. Discussion direction regarding auditing services for FY 2025 through 27.
Yes, sir. The item before you today is a summary and the staff's recommendation on how to move forward with auditors. In 2013, I believe it was, or fiscal year 13-14 at the state changed the rules on audit requirements. They stated, it's now stated that every 6 years you must change auditors, but you can't stay within the same auditing firm if you change partners. We have been with current auditors for many years now, and we went out in February on February 25th and we issued an RFP, request for a proposal on professional auditing services. We sent out 16 requests. We got 3 reviewed. I've talked to a number of other agencies, and they're finding similar response levels. We looked at what our needs are and how we're going to move forward with this. And staff's recommendation is to change auditors at this point, because we've been with the current auditors for 9 years now. And Our recommendation is to go with Hudson and Company out of Fresno, Kip Hudson.
Okay,
The chief is online if you wish to ask him any questions.
you have any questions?
But looking at the recap of the services and the dates upon which they would be, the years that are in question. So the end of, I guess, let me rephrase this. Hudson will begin their auditing process this year. Is that correct?
If we sign an engagement letter after the board meeting, we will start for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2025.
Okay. Right. Everything looks good to me.
And just one other clarification, and Director Thomas brought this up. If you go to page 2 of their submittal, they have audited financial statements at $39,700, but they have 3 items that are optional: certificate of debt service coverage, state controller's report, and single audit. Kip and I have discussed that, and we want that the auditors to do that work. We have that done currently. Single audits are for grant funds. Over a certain dollar amount, we have to file those. And so when we're looking at the cost for each year, it's just over $48,000. And he and I have had a very in-depth conversation on how we're going to approach this. He's familiar with the management letter that we went through and identified it, and he's already started laying out his work plan.
Can you say that he's online?
Yes. Kip, would you like to introduce yourself?
And you are muted.
Oh, okay. I think I'm off mute there now. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me. I've already learned a lot about you guys just watching the budget process here. So it's a good meeting to be at.
Okay, well, looking forward to working with you, and we're going to take this item to the board on our next meeting on the 28th, and you can get started.
And one more item. Knowing that the May 28th board meeting is packed, my request of your finance committee is to recommend that this item be placed on consent agenda.
That's fine.
Under that optional 2027, is that at Mr. Hudson's option or our option or mutual consent? Who's going to?
Mutual consent.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Then all your stuff?
That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll go to 3E, public comment. Pardon?
Just public comment on this.
Is there public comment? Do we have any public with us? All right. Where are we at? Utility billing aging report. Kelly?
Hello, Kelly.
Good afternoon. So I am just maintaining my monthly reporting on UB aging. I've done this for several months now per the request of Finance Committee. And at the direction of our previous directors, Cicada and Underhill, I have condensed this into more of a current reflection of where we stand, where we're just looking at maybe the last 2 to 4 months of delinquency for both our cycle 1 and cycle 2 areas. So we are maintaining a pretty consistent level of aging in regards to cycle 1, and that is our Valley Springs, Copperopolis, West Point, Wallace areas. And so what we're seeing is kind of an elevated percentage of outstanding receivables for our billing that is above what we see in this industry as a whole. So what we're looking to achieve every time we go out to bill a certain area is that we have less than 3% of the outstanding bill amount from just the prior billing. And we are sitting at about 10% for our cycle one group. And we're getting ready to bill them at the end of this week. So you need to see a little bit of change in that area. And with our cycle two, we are a lot closer to achieving that percentage, that industry standard. See a little bit more consistent, a little bit more reliable payment activity with our cycle two group, which is Abbott's Pass. So part of the reason why I'm reporting on this on a monthly basis is because it does go hand in hand with our delinquency process, which Jeff did speak about earlier. And so one of the things that we're moving towards between finance and customer service is to immediately reinstate those past due fees. We obviously have been committed to messaging and communicating that out to our customers. Before we go ahead and reinstate them, it has been a message that we've had on the bills themselves for the past several billing cycles. But with the recommendation of Finance Committee, I would like to move forward with reinstating those past due fees within the next few months.
Okay. Do you have any issue with that?
No, I don't. I think that we should have initiated them some time ago, but just to recap, it's only a $10 per billing cycle fee, isn't it?
That is correct. It's a flat fee of $10 per billing cycle, so up to $60 per calendar year.
So you have this,
That can be adjusted. And that's
It
up
can
to
be,
us.
yes.
it can be what?
That can be adjusted. That's a board decision. I mean, I think we're past due and revisiting that potentially. So.
Right.
So you frequently mention other agencies that you work with. What in some hypothetical prior agency, what was their amount that they charged?
So I have seen percentage charges that have been assessed at my first agency I worked for. We're talking about over 10 years ago. So I would have to see, if there are any limitations for our industry to apply, percentage type penalties towards bills. I am more familiar with seeing a lot of agencies with a flat cost that is related to the recouping the cost for just running the process. And so there's a nexus between what you're charging and what it costs to run the process itself from start to finish. And so I believe this $10 fee that we've had here at CCWD has been in effect for many, many years and has not necessarily been evaluated to ensure that it's covering all costs. So that could be something we could do as a part of a smaller kind of fee study type situation where we just make sure that we are recovering the appropriate cost for running the process.
Okay, if you're going, the next bill is going to go out on 3 days from now, and it's going to have a note on it that says that be aware that if you don't pay this, you have a potential $10 or what?
Well, what I would like to do is I would like for this bill that's going out this week and then the next one that goes out in June for cycle 2 to let folks know that effective July 1st, we are reinstating the fees and that's when they will begin.
Okay, so personally, I think that we ought to do a quick study and have that billing notice be inclusive of a higher fee if we can justify it.
Okay,
But I like the idea that we not have a percentage, it should be cost recovery. So,
okay. I will look into that and I can bring that to next finance committee.
okay, and you have your dartboard
I
there
do.
in your office?
I do.
for your cost study?
Yes, but I think at this point, just coupled with the payment behavior that we've been seeing consistently, and as I've spoken about in the past, we have not moved forward with any kind of delinquency process here at CCWD since the moratorium was put, in effect during COVID, and in communication with many of our other, neighboring agencies, we seem to be one of the only ones that are not moving forward with shutoffs as a mechanism for non-payment. So this is just the first step in bringing that process back. But we really need to take into consideration the fact that, we are seeing kind of an elevated number of accounts and an elevated, dollar amount that is showing in our aged receivables over time.
Okay, we don't, the only recourse that we have is to shut it off. I think that in other agencies, they may have the ability to just shut the flow down to a minimum to fill a toilet bowl type of a flow. It's kind of draconian to shut down a household, but maybe a rattling of a saber will get the money to start flowing again. I'd be curious you mentioned some of the nearby agencies. You've got contacts with those people. Why don't you just call them up and say, when did you do this? Has it resulted in a significant increase in payments?
I'm in very close contact with our colleagues at Tuolumne Utilities, and we've actually met with them on a couple of occasions, and I'm in close contact with their customer service supervisor over there. And we've talked about this several times over the last several months. And when the moratorium was lifted, they immediately reinstated their shutoffs. So they do resort to fully shutting off and discontinuing service for non-payment. But I can reach out to some of the other agencies. I am aware of others that I follow through forums for water service, and many of them are had to resort back to shutting off service.
Okay, are you ready to shut them off?
Yeah, sure.
Well, first step would be reinstating these penalties, and then I can go ahead and report back on our success there, and would like to see where we go from that point if.
But also bringing back the consideration of maybe raising it.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right.
Item number 4, Director of Administrative Service comments.
Thank you very much, Kelly.
Thank you.
I have no further comments at this time.
All right, General Manager comment?
Just a couple. One, we have a board vacancy currently. Director Cicada has left the board. The window of time for folks to submit their letter of interest is open. We left it open for longer than the minimum required. And we've been trying to do some outreach to make sure folks are aware of that opportunity. And so the current plan is to have, I believe that filing deadline is the 27th. We will have a special board meeting on May 30th to appoint to interview candidates and for the board to consider an appointment at that time. We have a board meeting coming up next Wednesday, the 28th. We have a very full agenda scheduled for that meeting. So we have a lot of business to conduct that day, including the full board review of the preliminary budget. So we're looking forward to that. We have, as Jeff mentioned, the approval of the loan documents, as we discussed at the last board meeting, the decision between public placement and or public offering and private placement for the debt issuance, and consistent with what would the way that discussion went at our last board meeting, after following up some more, we decided that the best option for us right now is that private placement. And so we'll be able to actually bring to the board approval of loan documents at that meeting on the 28th. Approval of those loan documents will also allow us to award contract for the C-Tank transmission line project in copper. So we're looking forward to both of those things. So those are finance related forecasts for the upcoming board meeting. I guess unfortunate news is the Army Corps work plan came out, and there's not only did we not receive the funding we requested for this fiscal year, the whole state of California didn't get any money for this year in the Army Corps work plan for the Section 219 program. So we'll continue to, I think it just underscores the importance of trying to get those legislative appropriations so that we can't just get left out of the work plan at the Army Corps discretion. So it's just as Mia has already indicated, redoubling that effort to make sure that we have federal budget appropriations next year. So we'll be reporting back on that as well. I think that's it for finance.
So will that postpone the raising of Pond 6 for another year?
No, that's really the last increment. What we've been seeking is the last increment of funding that would be utilized after the dam raise is complete for the replacement of the tertiary filter and completion of the project. So we're still moving ahead with the dam raise, and the SAF has already been ordered. So we will get that piece of pre-treatment equipment that our crew will install, and then we'll move ahead with the dam raise.
And do I remember correctly that the Corps will be heading up that dam raise effort?
Yes.
Do they have somebody, men and equipment ready to start that work, or what?
No, so they will hire a contractor. So they'll award a construction contract for the project. We continue to see a revolving door of project managers on that work effort, which is frustrating, but we're working through it.
Okay.
All right. Anything else?
Nope.
Do you have any comments, Director? Comments?
No, just want to report that went to the Aqua meeting in Monterey and learned a lot. It was a good conference.
All right, so our next meeting, or somebody's next meeting, is going to be Tuesday, June 17th. And the meeting's adjourned.